In the pre-state period, creating settlements was a way of asserting the Jewish claim to the land in the national conflict between two national movements. And it was a way of staking a claim to the borders of the future. It was very much part of the revolutionary arsenal of pre-independent Zionism. Okay, the State of Israel was established by very young people, which I suppose is not uncommon in revolutions, but many of the people who were involved were quite young at the time. Many of them were still the people who were in government 19 years later. 19 years is like, okay, when you're 19 years old, it's a long time, but later, not so much, right? I think that a lot of them sort of reverted to their pre-state mentality. The metaphor I like to give is this. If there's a story by Steinbeck, it's taking place early in the 20th century, and somebody's uncle or grandfather is one of these old men who is living in California, is described as being furious that the ocean stopped them from continuing to move further west. Like, that was their lives, was moving further west, and then the ocean got in the way.
Yeah,
right?
I suppose from a psychological angle as well. I mean, people's identities are formed, in the crucible of late adolescence.
And especially if you fight a war
exactly.
and you win a revolution during that time.
Exactly. So they must have felt something was missing in their lives in a very...
So all of a sudden, like, what would have happened if suddenly you woke up one morning when one of those old men and said, oh, by the way, California has expanded 200 miles to the west. Well, of course, you'd be excited, right? So here, you would go back from having your farm to saying, okay, well, let's, put the wagons together and move further west, right? So all these people had sort of gotten used to the adult reality, that the reality was less than their dreams. They'd gone from being revolutionaries to what I call institutionaries, people who had to live within the boundaries of running a country. And this new reality psychologically took many of them back to their pre-state state of mind. Oh, we'll build a settlement, we'll change the borders. And then there were also people who said things like, well, because of the excitement at the end of the war and the successive state of Israel, millions of Jews are going to come to Israel from the West and from the Soviet Union, and our population will grow, so the Arab population won't matter.
Right, so people were saying, well, if the Zionist dream actually continues to realize and there is a massive ingathering of Jews from other parts of the world, then we can have our cake and keep it, and even maybe give these people in scare quotes, as in the Palestinian population of Judea and Samaria,
we can make them all citizens
full voting rights,
and we'll still have a majority.
Yeah. So there was a segment that was thinking in those ways.
In 1972, there was a debate in the Labour Party Central Committee about the future of the West Bank, and the finance minister, who was a numbers whiz, got up and said, birth rates are the same as compound interest. You were all supposed to learn how to do compound interest in elementary school. You're talking about bringing all these Jews from the Soviet Union in the West. I'm telling you, he says, what are we going to have in the State of Israel when it's 50 years old in 1998? He says, if things go on the way they are, with the populations growing at the rate they are, he said something like 48% of the population will be Arab in 1998. And if all the massive immigration you talk about happens, it will be 40% Arab. And that's not what Zionism set out to create, a binational state. As it happened, there was one chunk of that immigration did happen from the Soviet Union in the 90s, and around 1998, if I remember my calculations correctly, the figure was 44%.
Of people
between the river and the sea,
right,
were Arab, whether that means Arab citizens of Israel or residents of the occupied territories. So
it's curious to me what psychologically is going on with people for whom that did not resonate. Because these aren't dumb people.
I think that if you look around our world today, you see an awful lot of examples of people ignoring obvious truths because it doesn't fit their political conceptions.
Meaning their ideological constructs.
We're sitting here on a very hot afternoon in Jerusalem. Everybody you can talk to in Jerusalem will tell you that summer afternoons in Jerusalem are hotter than they used to be, and that there's more hot afternoons in Jerusalem than there used to be. But the leadership of the most powerful country in the world ideologically denies that climate change is going on because it's uncomfortable for their program. And that's just one example. They knew they had a problem. They came up with ideas that would allow them in one way or another to have what they thought, or they convinced themselves to have what they want without bearing the price. And there were people who said that's not going to work and were issuing warnings, but they did not have ultimately control of how things went. And one of the reasons that they didn't is because the people who wanted to keep land could create settlements, but the people who did not want to keep land could not uncreate settlements. They could protest. Right. They were the means available to them were much less effective. So this began as a project essentially of the Labor Party. To get back to our original thread, by the time Labor left power in 1977, there were nearly 80 settlements already existing in the Sinai, Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. A town had been established in the Golan Heights, which is still there, Katzrin. The city of Yamit had been founded as the pet project of Moshe Dayan in the Sinai. The foundation had been built. The Likud, when it came to power, built on that foundation and built much more quickly than Labor did for all sorts of reasons. They had fewer internal arguments about the future of the territory. They weren't committed to socialist settlement, so they weren't held back by the number of people who were still willing to live in kibbutzim. But they basically built on that foundation and expanded it much more widely.
Up till this point, it hadn't had a particularly religious or messianic flavor relative to previous
So here's
periods.
another part of what's going on here. I can make a couple of suggestions of why it stuck in people's mind as being a religious project. One reason is that in certain specific places, there was a disagreement between the religious activists and the government at crucial moments. Particularly during the period of the first Rabin government, 74 to 77, there was a major clash between the young religious activists and the government over settling in the mountain ridge area, the strip running, if you're looking at a map, vertically north of Jerusalem, from Jerusalem up through Ramallah and Nablus and Jenin. The religious activists wanted to settle there. Rabin did not want to have settlement there. There were people in his government, including Shimon Peres, who was then defense minister, who did want to have settlement there.
Shimon Peres himself wanted.
Shimon Peres was a disciple of Moshe Dayan and was known as one of the most hawkish figures in the Labor government.
Hawkish with respect to
holding on to land, territorial maximalism.
Just to briefly hack the mind of Shimon Peres at the time, for security purposes or for ideological purposes, mythological attachment?
Well, he gave military reasons, and it seems, you know what, hacking the mind of Shimon Peres is... I'm not going to go there.
Fair enough.
But the clash that the public saw was between thousands of young religious people coming out and saying, we want to start a settlement here, and the government ordering the army to take them away. So that was public, and that was big.
Right.
And that was on headlines and time after time, and it was in television, and you saw it, and angry people were yelling at each other, and soldiers were dragging people away. Meanwhile, the government is establishing kibbutzim in the Jordan Rift along the Jordan River and is building a town in the Golan Heights, and that's not controversial, so that's not in the newspaper every day. Beyond that, the government often acted very quietly. I mean, I found documents that said, like, we're going to establish this settlement on such and such a day, alert the military censor.
You mean military censor for journalistic purposes? We don't
Right.
want this out in the public.
Right. In those days, the military censor was a leftover, like many bad things in Israeli law, of colonial rule. The British had imposed all sorts of things to keep control of the local population. Censorship was actually probably a result of World War II. Around 1989, 1990, there was a major Israeli Supreme Court case which drastically cut back on the authority of the military censor, but in those days, the military censor had a lot of power. So basically they're saying is, we don't want publicity. Another case, the minister in charge says there will be no ceremony. Right? The idea is, act quietly. We want to create facts on the ground. We don't want to make a fuss. Right. Meanwhile, you have this group of young religious activists who very much felt that until that point in Israeli history, they were pretty much on the sidelines, or very much the junior partner, and they were glorying in their big public historical role.
Right, because religious Zionism had been comparatively a small
religious Zionism had been like the religious auxiliary of Zionism
right.
before 1967. And I would say in many ways it still is, despite all
of it. And before 67, if my understanding is correct, they were quite dovish with respect to...
Their political leadership was quite dovish, yeah.
Yeah, so something happened there. Was it a generational shift amongst these youngsters in Sebastia?
It was partially a generational rebellion. You know, our fathers have been willing to be sort of the kashrut supervisors, the guy with the kippah checking the food for the secular government. We want an involvement in the whole range of government. We were always second best. Now we want to be the vanguard.
We want to take part in that larger Zionist project that we had always sort of played second fiddle to.
And we don't only want to take part in it, we want to be the leaders of it.
Right. Yeah. So are they modeling themselves in a way after the secular kibbutz movement of
Absolutely.
the prior 48 period?
Absolutely.
Prior to 48, I should
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is one of the many cases in modern religious history where a secular idea is absorbed into a religion and theologized.
say. It sounds like the Iranian Revolution in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could give lots and lots of examples. This is by no means unique. It's
Right.
only, this is what happened here. We are part of a bigger world. The only difference is that people pay more attention to Israel.
Yeah, there's a certain strange psychological fetishization, but for a whole number of reasons.
I call Israel the Paris Hilton of the nations. Why are we celebrities? Because we're celebrities. Everybody has always covered us, so they just keep on covering us. The part that was controversial in Israel was not settling in occupied territory. The part that was controversial was settling in this particular territory. And the people who were most public about their desire to settle in that particular territory and who went public defying the government over it, not an argument in the cabinet room, but a public demonstration, were the young religious activists. So the thing was firmly planted in public mind and coverage that settlers are these religious people and that the people who oppose them are secular.
What degree of intentionality is it fair to read into that process with respect to this sort of good cop, bad cop, or sort of,
Oh gosh,
you know,
I don't know.
like,
Do
because
you think the government was letting the religious be the bad cop? No, I don't think. The disagreement was a real disagreement.
It was a legitimate disagreement, but the government was the people in the government at the time were more than happy for that to be the focus as opposed to the other settlements.
They didn't want it to happen. It wasn't like they were using this as a.
It wasn't a smoke screen.
No, they would have preferred that their. I told you again, their policy was do things quietly. They didn't want there to be a fuss at all. They did not want there to be a public fuss about settlement in the territories. It drew attention to the whole subject.
Right.
I mean, to the extent that I can read their feelings, I'm not sure if they were saying that, but they were.
I suppose I'm reading it anachronistically in the sense
They were
that
not looking. They were not using the religious settlers as a scarecrow. They weren't using it to distract attention from the other thing. They simply, within the larger program, the larger acceptance of the idea that at least in some places in the occupied territory, Israelis will settle and we will keep those areas, there was a disagreement about which areas. It was a matter not of whether, but of where.
Right, and you still see this reflected today, but I guess I'm more cynical about what we see in the news today because you have, you have these outposts that are actually hooked up to the Israeli grid. You know, everything's provided for them, and then once the international pressure builds or a show has to be made, then the government will come and they'll dismantle one particular outpost.
The map of the outpost is Ariel Sharon's settlement map.
Right. So I guess it's hard for me to read this history without that in mind. But you're saying at the time, that sort of duplicitous intentionality doesn't seem to be there in the paper trail.
I'm not sure that I wouldn't agree with the way that you framed it in terms of duplicitous intentionality here. It's not like they set this up and said, "Oh, we can take one of these down when the pressure builds." No settlement was ever created with the intention of taking it down, at least as far as I know. And I've been through the documents on a lot of settlements being established. I can't say I've been through every single one. Maybe I missed something. But the overall pattern is there's a psychological pattern of you establish it to keep it there and you have an anxiety that you won't be able to.
Okay.
And the anxiety probably strengthens your desire to keep it there and to build it up.
How do you then make sense of the fact that you do see the Israeli government, even recent Likud governments, acting to take down certain outposts today, even though many other nominally illegal outposts are supported in many other ways by the government? I mean, how do you make sense of that?
There are specific cases in which they went beyond what they could justify in terms of Israeli law. For instance,
sometimes it becomes egregious, essentially.
They built on land. They allowed an outpost to be built on land that was legally registered in a surveyed land registry to a Palestinian owner. And then it went from being a political issue to a straightforward issue of property law, with the fact that the 1907 Hague Convention makes it very clear that the occupying power cannot seize private property for anything but the benefit of the local residents or for immediate military purposes, and it's quite clear that this was neither one of those. So somebody goes to court, Palestinian landowner, usually with the help of an Israeli organization, goes to court and says, excuse me, this settlement's built on my field. And the court says, well, property law.
Right. So once something actually is presented to the judiciary branch of the government, there are checks and balances in the system, and what we see is not necessarily some masterminded shell game, but you have certain elements in the government, in the executive branch, let's say, or the legislative executive branch, that want things to happen, and then people come forward.
Yeah, all these theories that have people playing double and triple games and whatever. Start with the fact that governments are not monoliths. They act in confusing fashions. They're not infinitely wise in their good actions or in their bad actions. It's not like they've got everything planned out 12 chess moves in advance. And if this happens and they fail at this and it brings this result, that's because they messed up.
Assuming competence before malevolence, essentially.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, the malevolence can be there, but assume mistakes before conspiracy. No, it's not a shell game. They pushed the boundary a little bit too far, and even though the Israeli judicial review, the checks and balances are weak, they got to a point where the court could simply not ignore how egregious this particular violation of something so basic to a modern legal system was taking place, and said, no, that land belongs to him.
Right.
And
the judicial system has an interest in preserving its own integrity and believability as an institution. There's a breaking point.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I'll tell you what's more relevant to what we see now, in my view, which is that in mainstream Israeli discussion, you'll hear a real lot about the so-called settlement blocks, which are these big suburban settlements, and the isolated settlements. Now, and people will say, well, obviously we can keep building in the settlement blocks because obviously no matter what form a peace agreement takes, we're going to have to hold on to the settlement blocks because they're just too big to give up. And we'll have to work out some sort of arrangement, territorial exchanges, whatever, but we all know we're keeping the settlement blocks.
The blocks are too big to fail, essentially.
Yeah. But those isolated settlements, that's like, keep building there, and you're obviously trying to foil a peace agreement, and so people in the center, slightly center left, will say, settlement in the building in the blocks is okay, but building outside the blocks isn't okay. And I think this is that there's a lot of self-deception going on there, because the blocks are not viable as the lines for a peace agreement. And what is true is the blocks include a lot more sort of mainstream bourgeois Israelis, including secular Israelis. So you say, all those religious settlements out there, they have to go, and those people who are insisting that we build in those little religious settlements, they're the problem. But my brother-in-law who lives in Mali Dumim, he's not the problem.
Is there not something to be said for the fact that those settlement blocks probably are not going to be turned over to Palestinian jurisdiction in the optimistic case of a two-state solution?
Well, I always say I don't report on the future. I'm saying that they chop the Palestinian state to be up into weird shapes, and that they violate territorial integrity, and if you want to get down to a percentage of the West Bank that Israel keeps and still keep those places, they become little spots of land at the end of long tendrils attached to the state of Israel, and I don't think that they'd be viable communities. And every additional house you build there makes the problem worse. So why expand them? It doesn't make any more sense to be building another apartment in Mali Dumim than it does to build another apartment in Ofra. Either way, you're getting in the way of a two-state outcome, and the point of a two-state outcome is that it is a way of reconciling the desires of both Palestinians and Israeli Jews for national self-determination while having democratic political systems in both places. Because the underlying flaw with this whole one-state idea is that it essentially ends up denying two groups of people who are highly mobilized in terms of wanting national self-determination. It ends up denying it to both of them. To come up with a political outcome which says that the Israelis and the Palestinians uniquely in the early 21st century are going to give up on their national aspirations, no matter what you think of nationalism, it's just not a very realistic political approach. Now, this is more difficult to explain in America than it is in Europe, because it's not an explicit part of the political debate. the way it is in Europe. But you go to Spain and
it's just a huge bubble.
Catalonia is demanding independence, or you go to the UK and Scotland is still arguing about whether to have independence, and it's very clear that nationalism is not over. So then you come and say, okay, but the Israelis and the Palestinians, they should just be happy with one person, one vote. They can give up on national self-determination. All right, that may be great for the philosophy classroom, but for sort of what I would call the classroom of political engineering, where you're trying to come up with real solutions to real problems, it's a perpetual motion machine. It's not smart. So you have that as essentially, where does this conflict come down to? Two groups of people, each of whom has a history in the same homeland between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, who in modern historical terms define themselves as nations in the ethno-nationalist sense, each want political self-determination. And in their dreams, they each want the whole of that land. In order to give them national self-determination in such a way that they can also have democratic systems, they have to give up on the dream of the whole land.
It does seem to me as a...
And that's harsh, and it gets more difficult every day.
Exactly, it gets more difficult. So the question in my mind is, are we past this point of no return? Like, is it just not a reasonable expectation?
In theoretical terms, you don't have a choice, like, is this the right choice or not? The choice is, how much does this choice cost versus that choice? So what's the cost of a two-state outcome versus not having a two-state outcome? And I still think that the cost of the other is higher. That doesn't mean that the cost of the two-state outcome isn't continuing to rise. The logical conclusion to come from that is that if the least costly but damned expensive outcome is a two-state outcome, then don't add to the cost by continuing to build in the settlements.
Are you saying that as an Israeli taxpayer? I mean, just like literally stop using my money to do something that seems to be against our...
Yeah, also on the financial level, yes. Nobody knows how much the settlements are costing us. There's no line in the budget that says settlements. It's woven throughout the entire subject. It's one of the least budget. It's one of the least transparent things in Israeli politics. We don't even know how much money we're spending on it, but it's way too much. So yes, on the tax level, but also on the political level. You're investing political capital. You're paying people to go out there. You're creating the situation, and one day you're going to have to pay them to come back. This is not smart. If you've seen the movie Argo, there's a scene in which the CIA agent is asked, "Don't you have a better bad plan than this?" And he says, "No, sir, this is the best bad plan we have." So a two-state outcome is the best bad plan we have. The fact that it's a costly, painful, increasingly costly plan, not just economically, but socially and politically, does not mean that the other plan is better. It just means that it's really not smart to continue making it more costly.
Do you see any signs of that momentum slowing? I mean, what would it take for that?
Nothing that has happened that is important in the Middle East, or for that matter, world politics, in the years that I've been covering it, was expected by any of the experts. None of the Sovietologists expected the Soviet Union to come apart or for the communism to fall apart. Nobody expected Syria to fall apart in 2011. Nobody expected the Arab Spring. The Six-Day War wasn't on the books. I came to Israel in September of 1977. In November of 1977, I was sitting in a greasy spoon downtown with some college friends. And the way things happened in those days is that when the radio news came on the hour, it was turned up in every locale in Israel, including the restaurant you were sitting in. And the radio comes on and the announcer says, "President Sadat of Egypt is coming here on Saturday night." This was Thursday night. It was like the Orson Welles broadcast. It was impossible. It could not be happening. It happened. You want me to tell you what's going to happen next? I'm not in that business.
That's wonderful. That's a great point to end on. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that.
לפיכך נתכנסנו, אנו חברי